In the dusty streets of Jericho, where the midday sun beat mercilessly upon the ancient cobblestones, a heart-wrenching cry pierced through the murmur of the crowd. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The voice came from a man sitting by the roadside, his eyes closed forever beneath eyelids that had never known light. The people around him silenced him violently, pushing him, telling him to be quiet. But he shouted louder, with a desperation that seemed to spring from the deepest part of his soul. And then, everything stopped. The footsteps ceased. The murmur became silence. A voice, serene but full of authority, cut through the air like a ray of light in the darkness. "Call him." In that moment, Bartimaeus' destiny was about to change forever. But what would happen next would not only transform his life, but would reveal a profound truth about faith, redemption, and the power of a cry in the midst of silence. This is the story you are about to discover, a story that has resonated through 2,000 years and continues to speak to us today with unshakable urgency. There are stories in Scripture that seem simple at first glance, brief accounts that occupy barely a few verses, but when explored, reveal layers of meaning so profound they can change our understanding of faith itself. The healing of Bartimaeus is one of those stories, a moment that occurred in a matter of minutes but encapsulates eternal truths about persistence, radical faith, and the transforming power of encountering the divine. Why was this blind beggar, among all those crying out for help in the streets of Jericho, the only one mentioned by name in the Gospels? What was in his cry that moved the heart of Jesus when thousands followed him? And what did it really mean for him to open his eyes for the first time in his adult life and see the face of the one who had restored him? In the next 60 minutes, we are going to dive deeply into this extraordinary story, exploring not only what happened that day on the road to Jericho, but the historical context that surrounded it, the layers of theological meaning it contains, and the urgent lessons it has for us in the 21st century. We will walk through the dusty streets of Jericho, understand the desperation of a man trapped in physical and social darkness, witness the dramatic moment of his healing, and discover how this encounter of seconds reverberated through Christian history. Prepare to see this ancient story with completely new eyes, because what is about to be revealed could challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, persistence, and the true meaning of seeing. To truly understand what happened that day in Jericho, we must first transport ourselves 2,000 years back to a city that was much more than a simple point on the map. Jericho, known as the City of Palms, was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, a green oasis in the midst of the arid desert of Judea. Its walls had witnessed Joshua's conquest, had seen kings and prophets, had heard the prayers of countless generations. In Jesus' time, Jericho was a prosperous city, enriched by the trade of balsam and dates, a place where the wealthy of Jerusalem built their winter palaces to escape the cold of the mountains. Herod the Great's palace rose majestically on the outskirts of the city, a testament to Roman power and opulence that contrasted brutally with the poverty that filled its streets. It was a city of extremes, where obscene wealth coexisted with absolute misery, where tax collectors like Zacchaeus accumulated fortunes, while beggars died of hunger on the corners. The streets were filled with pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for Passover, merchants shouting their wares, Roman soldiers patrolling with their hobnailed sandals echoing on the stones, Pharisees in their impeccable robes discussing the Torah, and sinners seeking redemption. In this world divided between light and darkness, between messianic hope and Roman oppression, lived a man whose entire life had been wrapped in literal darkness. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, his name literally means son of honor, a cruel irony for someone society considered to have no honor at all. We don't know exactly when he lost his sight, whether he was born blind, or if some illness or accident deprived him of vision in his youth. But what we do know is that by the time Jesus passed through Jericho, Bartimaeus had spent decades in darkness. Imagine for a moment what it meant to be blind in the first century in Judea, in an era with no social support system, no charitable organizations, no disability pensions, no schools for the blind, no technology that could help. For Bartimaeus, blindness was not just a physical condition, but a sentence of social death. He couldn't work in the fields because he couldn't see to harvest. He couldn't be a merchant because he couldn't see his goods or count money. He couldn't join any trade because all required sight. The only option left to him was begging, sitting day after day in the same place by the roadside, extending his calloused hand, begging for the coins that would allow him to buy enough bread to survive another day. But even in this he faced almost insurmountable obstacles, because in the Jewish culture of the time, many believed that physical disability was divine punishment for sin, either one's own or one's parents'. The Pharisees debated whether a blind man had sinned in his mother's womb, or if his parents had committed some terrible transgression. This cruel theology meant that when Bartimaeus extended his hand asking for help, many passed by not just out of indifference, but out of religious disgust, convinced that helping him would be somehow complicity with sin. Day after day, Bartimaeus sat in his place, listening to the world pass around him, the conversations that never included his name, the laughter he never shared, the commercial transactions in which he never participated. He heard the footsteps of thousands of people, but to most of them he was invisible, as much a part of the urban landscape as the stones of the road. His only companions were other beggars, lepers, paralytics, the cast-offs of society who formed their own marginal community on the peripheries of respectable city. But there was something in Bartimaeus that distinguished him from many others in his situation, something that burned within him like a flame that decades of darkness had not been able to extinguish: hope. Because Bartimaeus, despite his physical blindness, saw something that many with perfect eyes could not see. He had heard the rumors circulating through Jericho like uncontrollable fire, amazing stories about a rabbi from Nazareth who healed the sick, who made paralytics walk, who restored sight to the blind. The merchants passing through Jericho spoke of him, the pilgrims shared testimonies, even some of the beggars had heard first-hand accounts of impossible miracles. Bartimaeus had heard them all, each story feeding a hope that grew in his heart like a plant in fertile soil. It was not a vague or general hope, but specific and personal. If this Jesus was truly the promised Messiah, the Son of David that the Scriptures had predicted, then he, Bartimaeus the blind, the marginalized, the invisible, could be healed. This hope became his obsession, his reason to keep living day after day. While other beggars resigned themselves to their fate, Bartimaeus waited, listened, prepared his faith like a drawn bow, waiting for the moment to release. And that moment was about to come. It was the spring of the year 30 AD approximately, and Jesus had begun his final journey to Jerusalem, the journey that would culminate at the cross. He and his disciples had been traveling through Perea, east of the Jordan, and now they were crossing back toward Judea, and Jericho was an obligatory stop on the road to the holy city. It was not a quiet or discreet journey, because by this time, Jesus' fame had reached massive proportions. Wherever he went, crowds followed him, some seeking healing, others wanting to see the miracles they had heard about, others hoping he would declare himself the king who would expel the Romans. The atmosphere was charged with messianic expectation, especially because Passover was approaching, and hopes for national liberation always intensified during this festival that commemorated the liberation from Egypt. The disciples walked close to Jesus, but they were confused and frightened because Jesus had been repeatedly telling them about his imminent death, predictions they refused to fully understand or accept. In their minds, they were going to Jerusalem, not for their master to die, but to establish his kingdom. The tension between Jesus' mission and his followers' expectations was reaching its peak. Meanwhile, in Jericho, Bartimaeus woke up that morning like any other, not knowing this would be the last day he would live in darkness. He dragged himself to his usual place by the road, spread his cloak on the ground to collect coins, and began his daily routine of begging mercy from passers-by. But this day was different. He could feel it in the air, in the unusual energy of the city, in the extraordinary number of footsteps he heard passing on the road. Something big was happening, but what? Then he heard it, first as a distant murmur that gradually grew, excited voices, hurried footsteps, a tumult approaching like a wave. Bartimaeus tensed. His heart began to beat faster. He had been in Jericho long enough to distinguish the different types of crowds. Pilgrim processions had a specific rhythm, merchant caravans another, Roman parades a completely different one. But this was unique. It had the chaotic energy of popular expectation mixed with reverence. "What's happening?" Bartimaeus asked someone passing nearby. "It's Jesus of Nazareth passing through," was the answer that would change his life forever. Jesus of Nazareth. The name struck Bartimaeus like lightning. All the stories he had heard, all the nights he had prayed, all the times he had imagined this moment, everything converged in this instant. The Messiah, the Son of David, the healer of the blind, was here now, passing through this very road. This was his chance, possibly his only chance. If Jesus passed by, he might never return. This was literally a matter of now or never, of faith or resignation, of action or eternal regret. And in that moment of absolute clarity, Bartimaeus made the most important decision of his life. He was going to shout. He was going to cry out. He was going to make Jesus hear him no matter what. And so he began to shout with all the strength of his lungs, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." His voice pierced through the noise of the crowd, desperate, raw, with nothing to lose. But immediately he felt rough hands pushing him, harsh voices telling him to be quiet. "Shut up, beggar. Don't bother the master. Who do you think you are?" The crowd, in their zeal to protect Jesus, or perhaps in their own desire to be near him, saw Bartimaeus as a hindrance, as unwanted noise in a sacred moment. To them, this blind beggar didn't deserve the master's attention. There were more important people, deeper questions, more urgent needs. How dare this invisible nobody interrupt the Messiah's progress? But here is what is extraordinary, what reveals the true character of Bartimaeus and the radical nature of authentic faith. Instead of being silenced, he shouted even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." His voice rose above the rejection, above the shame, above all the voices that had told him for decades that he wasn't worthy, that he didn't matter, that he should accept his place in the shadows. In this moment, Bartimaeus teaches us something profound about true faith. Authentic faith is not polite, is not silent, does not give up when facing obstacles. True faith is desperate, persistent, even scandalous. It is the cry of the heart that knows it is before its only opportunity for redemption and absolutely refuses to let it pass. Bartimaeus had nothing to offer, no credentials to present, no theological argument to make. All he had was his desperate need and his radical faith that Jesus could and would want to help him. And it turns out that was more than enough, because then something happened that no one expected. In the midst of the noise and chaos, in the midst of the thousands of voices competing for his attention, Jesus heard Bartimaeus' cry and stopped. The Gospels record this moment with a simplicity that conceals its depth. Jesus stopped. The Messiah, on his way to Jerusalem and to the cross, with the weight of humanity's destiny on his shoulders, with the expectations of the crowds pressing him, with the clock of his earthly ministry running toward its conclusion, stopped for a blind beggar. This simple act of stopping reveals something fundamental about God's character, that no cry of faith goes unnoticed, that no person is too insignificant to deserve divine attention, that the kingdom of God operates with an economy radically different from that of the world, where the last are first and the invisible are seen. And then Jesus said something that changed everything. "Call him." Those two words transformed the atmosphere instantly. The same people who moments before had been silencing Bartimaeus now ran toward him with a completely different message. "Cheer up, get up, he's calling you." The crowd that had been an obstacle now became messengers of hope. And in this rapid change, we see something tragicomic about human nature. How quickly we change our attitude when we see that someone in authority values what we had despised. But Bartimaeus had no time for philosophical reflections on human hypocrisy. He heard the words, "He's calling you," and something exploded inside him. The text tells us something incredibly significant about what happened next, a detail we might easily overlook, but that is loaded with symbolism. He, throwing off his cloak, jumped up and came to Jesus. Throwing off his cloak, think about what this meant. A beggar's cloak was not just clothing, it was his most valuable possession, possibly his only real possession. It was his protection against the night cold, his carpet during the day, the place where people threw coins, his very identity as a beggar. For a man with nothing, his cloak was everything. And Bartimaeus threw it off without thinking twice. He didn't fold it carefully. He didn't give it to someone to take care of. He didn't secure it thinking, just in case this doesn't work and I need to go back to begging tomorrow. He threw it off. This dramatic gesture reveals the totality of his faith. Bartimaeus was not approaching Jesus with a backup plan. He was not hedging his bets. He was not being realistic about his chances. He was burning his ships, committing completely, acting with the absolute certainty that his life as a blind beggar had ended, even though he still couldn't see. This is the kind of faith that moves mountains. Faith that doesn't calculate probabilities, but jumps into the abyss trusting that there is someone waiting to catch it. He jumped up. He didn't walk carefully. He didn't get up gradually. He didn't move with the usual caution of a blind person navigating a world he can't see. He jumped, and somehow, through the chaos of the crowd, he made his way to where Jesus was. And there, face to face, although Bartimaeus couldn't see the face before him, occurred one of the briefest but most profound exchanges recorded in Scripture. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" This question might seem obvious, almost absurdly obvious. Here is a man clearly blind who has just shouted asking for mercy. Isn't it evident what he wants? But Jesus never asked obvious questions without reason. This question had multiple profound purposes. First, it forced Bartimaeus to articulate his faith, to make his desire specific and verbal, to actively participate in his own healing instead of being a passive recipient. Second, it dignified Bartimaeus by treating him not as a charity case, but as a person with agency, with voice, with the right to express his own desires. Third, and perhaps most important, the question acknowledged that physical healing is not the only need people have, and didn't assume he knew better than Bartimaeus what Bartimaeus really needed. Some in Bartimaeus' situation might have asked for money, or food, or some form of relief from their poverty, without necessarily asking for the healing that seemed impossible. Jesus was giving Bartimaeus the opportunity to dream big, to ask for the impossible, to express the deepest desire of his heart. And Bartimaeus didn't waste a second. His response was immediate and direct. "Rabboni, let me recover my sight." Rabboni, an intensely personal and intimate form of master, a title of profound respect and affection. And then his petition. Simple, clear, impossible. "Let me recover my sight." He didn't ask for partial healing. He didn't ask for help to cope with his blindness. He didn't ask for gradual improvement. He asked for the impossible, to completely recover something he had never had or had lost decades ago. And in this bold petition, we see the maturity of his faith. Because faith is not asking for small and achievable things. Faith is asking for miracles and believing that the one being asked can perform them. And then Jesus pronounced the words that would change everything. "Go, your faith has saved you. Not my power has healed you, not I have decided to cure you, but your faith has saved you." Jesus was pointing directly to Bartimaeus' faith as the instrument of his healing, validating every moment of persistent hope. Every story he had treasured, every night he had believed against all evidence that healing was possible. The Greek word translated as saved is sisoken, the same word used for spiritual salvation, and this is not accidental. Bartimaeus' physical healing was simultaneously an illustration of a deeper spiritual restoration, the transition from darkness to light, not only physically but existentially. And then immediately, in the instant Jesus pronounced these words, Bartimaeus recovered his sight. There was no gradual process, no slow adjustment, no days of recovery. Immediately. The text uses a word that emphasizes the instantaneousness, the immediacy of the miracle. One moment he was blind, the next moment he could see. Try to imagine, if you can, what that moment must have been. Decades of absolute darkness, and suddenly in a flash, light color form faces. The sky, the stones of the road, the palm trees of Jericho swaying in the wind, and above all, the face of Jesus, the first face he saw, the face of the man who had made him whole. Tears must have flowed immediately. Not only from his now functioning eyes, but from the deepest part of his soul. Tears of wonder, gratitude, joyful disbelief. Everything he had imagined, all the colors he had tried to understand through descriptions, all the faces he had constructed in his mind through voices. Everything was real, visible, overwhelmingly beautiful. He could see. But here is what makes this story even more extraordinary. What Bartimaeus did next. The Gospels record, "And immediately he recovered his sight and followed Jesus on the road." He followed Jesus on the road. He didn't run home to show his family his healing. He didn't go to the temple to offer the thanksgiving sacrifice prescribed by law. He didn't leave to celebrate his new life. He followed Jesus. This final detail reveals something profound about Bartimaeus' true character and about the nature of authentic faith. Healing was not the final goal, it was the beginning of a relationship. Bartimaeus didn't just want his eyes, he wanted to follow the giver of those eyes. He wasn't simply interested in what Jesus could do for him, he was interested in Jesus himself. And the road he followed was not just any road. It was the road to Jerusalem, the road to the cross. Bartimaeus, with his newly opened eyes, chose to follow Jesus towards suffering, rejection, and death. This completely transforms our understanding of what happened in Jericho. It was not simply the story of a healing miracle, it was the story of radical discipleship that began with a desperate cry and culminated in unshakable loyalty. While others followed Jesus when it was convenient or popular, Bartimaeus followed him because he had personally experienced his transforming power and nothing else mattered. And as Jesus walked toward Jerusalem, surrounded by his confused disciples and a fickle crowd that would soon shout, "Crucify him," there was among them a former blind beggar who now saw more clearly than anyone where they were going and why it was worth following. This story of Bartimaeus did not end that day on the road to Jericho, because the reverberations of what happened there extended through the centuries, impacting Christian theology, inspiring countless sermons, touching millions of hearts. The early Christians preserved this story with special care, including specific details like Bartimaeus' name, when many other miracles were recorded anonymously. Why? Because Bartimaeus probably became a known figure in the early church, a living witness to Christ's power, someone who could give personal testimony of what it meant to pass from darkness to light. Scholars suggest that Mark included his name because Bartimaeus was alive when the gospel was written and was known to Christian communities, a living resource who could confirm the account's truthfulness. Imagine Bartimaeus in the years following the resurrection, sharing his story again and again with whoever wanted to listen, his eyes shining not only because he could see, but because he had seen Jesus, had walked with him, perhaps even witnessed the crucifixion and resurrection. His testimony had unique power because it combined the indisputable physical miracle with profound spiritual witness. "I was blind, now I see, and the difference is not only in my eyes, but in my whole life." Throughout Christian history, Bartimaeus' healing has been interpreted at multiple levels, each revealing a different facet of its meaning. At the literal level, it is a physical healing miracle that demonstrates Jesus' power over diseases and his compassion for the marginalized. At the moral level, it is a teaching about the importance of persistent faith and willingness to leave everything to follow Christ. At the allegorical level, Bartimaeus represents all humanity trapped in spiritual blindness, and his healing symbolizes the illumination that comes through Christ. At the anagogical level, the deepest, it points toward the final restoration of all things when the blind will see, the deaf will hear, and every tear will be wiped away. The Church Fathers saw in Bartimaeus a model of conversion. Augustine of Hippo reflected on how Bartimaeus threw off his cloak, interpreting it as the act of discarding the old self, the old identities that keep us trapped. Origen saw in Bartimaeus' blindness an image of the human condition under sin, unable to see divine truth until Christ's grace opens our eyes. The Protestant reformers emphasized Jesus' declaration, "Your faith has saved you," using it as evidence that faith, not works, is the instrument of salvation. Liberation theologians have seen in Bartimaeus a revolutionary figure, someone who refused to accept his marginalization and demanded to be seen and heard, challenging the social structures that kept him in poverty. Each era, each context, each tradition has found in Bartimaeus something that speaks to their own struggles and hopes. And this is the mark of a truly sacred story, its capacity to speak multiple truths without losing its central power. But beyond theological interpretations, Bartimaeus' story has inspired concrete devotional practices. Bartimaeus' prayer, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," became the basis for the Jesus prayer in Eastern Orthodox tradition, one of the most powerful and widely practiced prayers in Christianity. "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." This prayer, repeated thousands of times a day by monks and lay people alike, carries at its heart the same desperate cry of Bartimaeus, the recognition of our absolute need for divine mercy and our faith that Christ can and wants to respond. Bartimaeus' healing also profoundly influenced how the Christian Church has understood and responded to disability throughout the centuries. On one hand, the story has inspired countless efforts to heal and care for the blind and others with disabilities, from the first Christian hospitals to modern missionary organizations that perform eye surgeries in developing countries. On the other hand, contemporary disability theology has challenged simplistic interpretations that see all disability as something that needs to be fixed, pointing out that Bartimaeus' value was not conditioned on his ability to see, and that God often works powerfully through what the world considers weakness. This theological tension is important and productive. It honors both the miracle of physical healing and the inherent dignity of people with disabilities, recognizing that while some are miraculously healed, many are not, and this does not reflect a lack of faith or divine favor, but the mystery of God's sovereignty. Bartimaeus' story has also been central in discussions about the role of faith in healing. His declaration, "Your faith has saved you," has been interpreted in very different ways. Some use it to argue that sufficient faith will always result in physical healing, an interpretation that has caused tremendous harm to sick people who then blame themselves for lack of faith when they are not healed. Others interpret more carefully, pointing out that Jesus did not establish a mechanical formula where a certain amount of faith automatically produces healing, but rather that Bartimaeus' faith was remarkable not for its quantity, but for its quality, its persistence in the face of rejection, its specificity in identifying Jesus as the Son of David, its willingness to risk everything. And most importantly, Bartimaeus' healing was not the result of a magic formula, but of a personal encounter with Jesus, who in his sovereignty chose to heal in that particular moment and place. This more nuanced interpretation honors both the importance of faith and God's sovereignty and mystery, avoiding the trap of turning faith into a tool of divine manipulation. But beyond theological discussions, Bartimaeus' story has resonated through the centuries because it touches something deeply human and universal, the experience of being trapped in some form of darkness, whether physical, emotional, spiritual, or existential, and the desperate longing for liberation. Every person who hears this story can see themselves reflected in some aspect of it, perhaps in Bartimaeus' darkness, perhaps in his social marginalization, perhaps in his persistent faith, perhaps in his willingness to leave everything to follow Christ. The story works on so many levels simultaneously that each listener can find their own entry point, their own connection with the account. And this is precisely what makes biblical stories eternal. They are not simply historical records of past events, but living narratives that continue to speak, challenge, console, and inspire each new generation. Artists throughout the centuries have tried to capture this extraordinary moment in painting, sculpture, and stained glass. From Byzantine mosaics to Renaissance paintings, from Gothic stained glass windows to contemporary art, the image of Bartimaeus throwing off his cloak and running toward Jesus has been recreated countless times, each artist trying to convey the raw emotion, the bold faith, the transforming moment. Rembrandt painted the scene with his characteristic mastery of light and shadow, literally using light to symbolize the spiritual illumination Bartimaeus was about to experience. El Greco captured the dynamism of the moment with his elongated figures and vivid color palette. Each artistic representation adds another layer of interpretation, another way to understand what happened that day in Jericho. In sacred music, Bartimaeus' story has inspired hymns, cantatas, and oratorios. The hymn Amazing Grace, though not specifically about Bartimaeus, perfectly captures his experience with the line, "I was blind, but now I see," a phrase that could have been spoken by Bartimaeus himself. Baroque composers like Bach and Handel included the healing of the blind in their passions and oratorios, using music to convey the transition from darkness to light, from lament to joy. Christian literature has also returned again and again to Bartimaeus. John Milton in Paradise Lost uses the image of spiritual blindness transformed into vision as a central theme. C.S. Lewis, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, creates a scene where Eustace has scales removed from his eyes, a direct echo of stories like Bartimaeus's. Flannery O'Connor, with her characteristic use of violence as a means of grace, often presents characters who experience moments of sudden illumination that reflect Bartimaeus's instant healing. Each of these literary works takes the core of the story, a sudden movement from darkness to light, and reimagines it in new contexts, demonstrating the archetypal nature of the narrative. In the context of contemporary ministry, Bartimaeus' story has become a foundational text for preachers and teachers. It is commonly preached at healing services, evangelistic campaigns, retreats about faith and discipleship. Preachers find in Bartimaeus a perfect model for teaching about persistent prayer, about bold faith, about the importance of not allowing the voices of the crowd to silence our cry to God. The story offers multiple application points. For those who suffer, it offers hope that Jesus sees and responds to our pain. For those who struggle with faith, it offers a model of imperfect but persistent faith. For those who feel marginalized, it offers the promise that no one is invisible to God. For those who have abundance, it offers a challenge about how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Medical missionaries working in eye hospitals in developing countries often invoke Bartimaeus' story, seeing their work of restoring physical sight as an image of the Church's broader mission to bring spiritual light to a world in darkness. Organizations like Orbis International and Christian Blind Mission have performed millions of eye surgeries, literally recreating Bartimaeus' miracle in modern medical terms, and see this work as a practical expression of Christ's heart for the blind and marginalized. In the realm of social justice, Christian activists have pointed to how the crowd tried to silence Bartimaeus as an example of how social and religious structures often function to keep the marginalized silent and invisible. They challenged the Church to ask itself, are we part of the crowd that silences the cries of the oppressed, or are we like Jesus who stops to listen and respond? This application is particularly powerful in contexts where the voices of the poor, immigrants, racial minorities, or those with disabilities are systematically ignored or suppressed. Bartimaeus' story becomes a prophetic call to the Church to ensure it is creating space for all voices to be heard, especially those that society would prefer to keep silent. In the context of liberation theology in Latin America, Bartimaeus has been seen as an example of someone who refused to accept oppression and actively demanded his liberation, a model for entire communities struggling against systemic injustice. Liberation theologians point out that Bartimaeus did not passively wait for Jesus to notice him, but took bold and risky action, shouting despite social rejection, an act of resistance against the norms that kept him marginalized. In contemplative and mystical spirituality, Bartimaeus' blindness has been interpreted as the dark night of the soul, those periods of spiritual drought where God seems absent and faith feels impossible. Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross wrote about how sometimes God takes us through periods of spiritual darkness, not as punishment, but as preparation for a deeper revelation. In this interpretation, Bartimaeus' long blindness was not simply a tragedy, but a preparation, a time of formation where his desire to see intensified to the point where his faith became strong enough to break through any obstacle. When he finally received his sight, he could appreciate it in a way that someone who had always seen never could. Similarly, those who have gone through the dark night of the soul often emerge with deeper faith and richer appreciation of God's presence than those whose faith has never been tested. In the charismatic and Pentecostal tradition, Bartimaeus' story has been used to teach about divine healing and the miraculous gifts of the Spirit. These communities emphasize that the same Jesus who healed Bartimaeus continues to heal today, through the power of the Holy Spirit. Healing services often invoke Bartimaeus' faith as a model for those seeking their own healing, encouraging them to cry out to Jesus with the same persistence and bold faith. At the same time, more mature charismatic communities also recognize the mystery of why some are healed and others are not, maintaining the tension between faith in God's power to heal and humble acceptance of His sovereignty. But now, after exploring all these historical, theological, and cultural layers, we must return to the most important question. What does this ancient story mean for us today, here, now, in the 21st century? How does this narrative of a blind beggar in an ancient city speak to our modern lives filled with technology, complexity, and challenges that Bartimaeus could never have imagined? The answer is that Bartimaeus' story touches something eternally human, truths that transcend time and culture. First, Bartimaeus teaches us about the nature of true faith. We live in an era that often treats faith as a private feeling, a personal preference, something we politely keep contained within appropriate boundaries. But Bartimaeus' faith was anything but contained. It was loud, desperate, scandalous, willing to risk public humiliation for a chance at transformation. His faith was not an abstract intellectual belief in theological propositions. It was a visceral and personal trust that Jesus could change his life. In a world that often reduces faith to the acceptance of certain doctrines or participation in certain rituals, Bartimaeus challenges us to ask ourselves, do we have the kind of faith that is willing to shout, to risk, to leave everything for an encounter with Christ? Or is our faith so polite, so reasonable, so carefully managed that it has lost its transforming power? Second, Bartimaeus teaches us about persistence in the midst of rejection. We all face moments when we feel our voice doesn't matter, when the crowds of our lives, whether real people, difficult circumstances, or our own internal doubts, tell us to shut up, not to bother, to accept our place. Bartimaeus refused to be silenced. When told to be quiet, he shouted louder. This was not foolish stubbornness, but determination born of desperation and faith. He challenges us to ask ourselves, what deep needs, what spiritual longings, what cries for justice or healing have we allowed to be silenced by the voices around us? What would happen if, like Bartimaeus, we refused to be silenced and kept shouting until Jesus hears us? In an age of social media, where voices constantly compete for attention and where it's easy to feel lost in the noise, Bartimaeus' persistence reminds us that our voice matters, especially when we cry out to God. Third, Bartimaeus teaches us about willingness to let go of the old to embrace the new. When he threw off his cloak, he was symbolically renouncing his entire former identity. His cloak was his security, however pathetic. It was the known, the familiar, even if it was miserable. Many of us cling to similar cloaks, old identities that no longer serve us, destructive thought patterns, toxic relationships, addictions, resentments, fears, all because at least they're familiar, and letting go of the familiar feels terrifying, even when the new promises to be infinitely better. Bartimaeus challenges us to identify our cloaks and ask ourselves, what am I holding on to that I need to let go of to experience the transformation God has for me? Fourth, Bartimaeus teaches us that the encounter with Jesus is not the end of the journey, but the beginning. We might expect that after receiving his sight, Bartimaeus would have returned to a normal life, gotten a job, settled down, enjoyed his new freedom. Instead, he immediately began following Jesus on the road. This challenges our tendency to treat Jesus as a cosmic problem solver we invoke when we need something, but then ignore once our immediate needs are met. Bartimaeus shows us that the true encounter with Christ is not transactional, but relational. It's not just about what Jesus can do for us, but about who he is and our response to follow him no matter where it leads. In our consumerist culture that treats even religion as a product we consume for our benefit, Bartimaeus calls us back to the radical understanding that following Jesus means exactly that. Following him, going where he goes, even when the road leads to difficult places. Fifth, Bartimaeus' story teaches us about God's radical attention to individuals. In the midst of crowds, with the weight of his cosmic mission upon him, Jesus stopped for one man. This directly contradicts our modern experience of feeling lost in the crowd, of being reduced to statistics, demographics, numbers. We feel invisible in our massive cities, in our corporate workplaces, even sometimes in our large churches. Bartimaeus' story assures us that to God, we are never part of an anonymous crowd. Each of us is seen, known, valued as a unique individual. Our cry, no matter how weak it may seem amid the noise of the world, is heard by God. Sixth, Bartimaeus teaches us about the dignity God grants to each person. When Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" he wasn't seeking information, he was granting dignity. He was treating Bartimaeus not as an object of charity, but as a subject with agency, with voice, with legitimate desires. This has profound implications for how we treat the vulnerable in our own society. Do we treat the poor, the homeless, refugees, those with disabilities as objects of our charity, or as subjects with inherent dignity? Do we ask them what they need, or assume we know better? Jesus' question to Bartimaeus challenges us to completely reconsider our approach to social justice and mercy. Seventh, Bartimaeus' story speaks powerfully about different types of blindness. Bartimaeus' physical blindness was obvious, but the story reveals there were other forms of blindness more dangerous. The crowd that tried to silence him was blind to his dignity and need. The religious leaders who taught that his blindness was punishment for sin were blind to God's true nature. Even the disciples, who walked with Jesus daily, were blind to the true nature of his mission. In our own time, we may have perfect physical vision, but be deeply blind to spiritual realities, to the needs of those around us, to our own flaws and sins. Bartimaeus invites us to pray, "Lord, make us see what we need to see. Open our eyes not only physically but spiritually, morally, relationally." Eighth, the story teaches us about the transforming power of calling Jesus by his true name and identity. Bartimaeus didn't simply shout Jesus, he shouted, "Jesus, Son of David," recognizing him as the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of prophecies. This theological confession, in the midst of his desperation, shows that even in our darkest moments, what we believe about Jesus matters. There is power in recognizing who he truly is. In an era where Jesus is often reduced to a moral teacher, an inspiring example, or an abstract concept of love, Bartimaeus challenges us to recognize Jesus in his fullness, as Lord, Savior, Son of God, the only one with power to fundamentally transform our lives. Ninth, Bartimaeus' instantaneous healing speaks to us about the nature of God's timing. Bartimaeus had been blind for decades, but his healing was instantaneous. Sometimes we pray for years for something and feel that God is not listening, that nothing is changing. Bartimaeus' story reminds us that God doesn't always work gradually. Sometimes, after long periods of waiting, he acts suddenly, dramatically, completely. Our task is not to understand God's timeline, but to remain faithful in the waiting, maintaining faith even when we see no change, trusting that when God acts, it will be complete and perfect. Tenth, and perhaps most profoundly, Bartimaeus' story is a perfect picture of the gospel itself. We are all Bartimaeus, sitting in spiritual darkness, impoverished in our sin, unable to save ourselves, completely dependent on someone coming and restoring us. Like Bartimaeus, we have nothing to offer except our desperate need. Like Bartimaeus, we hear that Jesus is passing and we know this is our only chance. Like Bartimaeus, we must cry out for mercy, recognizing that without it, we are lost. Like Bartimaeus, we find that when we cry out with faith, Jesus stops, sees us, calls us, and completely restores us. And like Bartimaeus, our appropriate response is not simply to enjoy our new freedom, but to follow Jesus wherever he goes. This is the gospel story told in a simple but profound narrative of a blind beggar on a dusty road 2,000 years ago. And this story continues to be told today, every time someone passes from darkness to light, from spiritual death to life, from despair to hope, through a transforming encounter with Jesus Christ. So, as we come to the end of this journey through Bartimaeus' story, we must ask ourselves some honest and challenging questions. First, in what areas of your life are you experiencing darkness right now? It may not be physical blindness, but we all have areas where we can't see clearly, where we're confused, lost, trapped. What are your areas of spiritual, emotional, or relational blindness? Second, what voices in your life are trying to silence you, to convince you that your cry doesn't matter, that you should accept your situation and not bother? Are they external voices of people who belittle you, or internal voices of doubt, shame, or despair? Are you willing to ignore those voices and cry out to Jesus anyway? Third, what is your cloak? What old identity? What false security? What familiar but destructive pattern do you need to throw off to experience the transformation God has for you? What is holding you back from jumping toward Jesus with complete abandon? Fourth, if Jesus asked you right now, "What do you want me to do for you?" what would be your honest answer? Not the answer you think you should give, not the theologically correct answer, but your deepest and real desire. Do you dare to ask him for the impossible, to dream big, to believe that he can do what seems impossible in your life? Fifth, are you treating Jesus as a convenient problem solver or as the Lord who deserves your total loyalty? Are you willing, like Bartimaeus, not only to receive from Jesus but to follow him, even when the road is difficult? Sixth, looking at your own life and community, are you part of the crowd that silences the voices of the marginalized, or are you creating space for the Bartimaeuses of your world to be heard? How are you treating those society considers insignificant? And finally, can you see how God has been working in your own darkness, preparing you for a moment of revelation? Can you trust that even the difficult seasons of your life are not punishment, but preparation for something deeper? These questions are not easy, and their answers may require brutal honesty with ourselves and with God. But it's worth wrestling with them, because Bartimaeus' story promises us that when we come to Jesus with genuine faith, honest desperation, and willingness to be transformed, he responds. Not always in the way we expect, not always according to our timeline, but always in ways that are better than we could have imagined. Bartimaeus' story ended with him following Jesus on the road to Jerusalem, and although the text doesn't specifically tell us what happened to him afterward, we can imagine. He was probably there when Jesus entered Jerusalem triumphantly, when the crowd shouted Hosanna, when they spread cloaks on the road, the same kind of cloak he had thrown off days before. He was probably there during the last week of Jesus' life, witnessing the confrontations with religious leaders, perhaps even present at the Last Supper. And when Friday came, when they arrested Jesus, when they beat him and crucified him, Bartimaeus, with his eyes now able to see, had to witness the brutality of the cross. Imagine what he must have felt, seeing the man who had given him sight now hanging in agony. Did he wonder if he had made the right decision in following Jesus? Did he feel tempted to return to his old life? But then Sunday came, and the man who had been dead was alive again. Bartimaeus saw the risen Christ, and in that moment every question was answered, every doubt was resolved. He had followed the right man, had placed his faith in the true Messiah, and now he was part of something infinitely greater than his own personal healing. He was part of the movement that would change the world, the birth of the church, the expansion of God's kingdom. And for the rest of his life, every time someone asked him about his eyes, about how a blind beggar had recovered his sight, Bartimaeus had a story to tell, a story of faith, persistence, transformation, and unshakable loyalty to the one who had made him whole. And that story, first told in the streets of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, has been told and retold millions of times since then. It has been whispered in catacombs by persecuted Christians, preached from magnificent pulpits in cathedrals, shared around campfires by missionaries in distant lands, taught in Sunday schools to wide-eyed children, meditated upon in monastery cells by solitary contemplatives, proclaimed at evangelistic crusades to crowds of thousands. And every time it is told, it has the power to touch hearts, open eyes, and change lives. Because at bottom, it's not just Bartimaeus' story, it's your story and my story. The story of every person who has passed from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from death to life through the transforming power of Jesus Christ. So as you reflect on what you have heard today, as you consider the layers of meaning in this ancient but eternally relevant account, my prayer is that you hear Jesus asking you personally, "What do you want me to do for you?" And that, like Bartimaeus, you have the courage to answer honestly, to cry out your need without shame, to throw off everything that holds you back, and to follow Jesus wherever he leads you. Because the same faith that saved Bartimaeus, the same grace that transformed him, the same Jesus who stopped for him is available to you today. No matter how long you've been in darkness, no matter how marginalized you feel, no matter how many voices have told you to shut up, Jesus is passing by your road right now. And if you cry out to him with faith, he will stop. He will see you. He will call you, and he will transform you completely. This is the promise of Bartimaeus' story. This is the promise of the gospel. And this promise remains as true and powerful today as it was 2,000 years ago on a dusty road outside Jericho.